I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Trump pushes back against Putin's 3-day ceasefire proposal, we discuss the recent reflections of the former commander of Ukraine's armed forces and his bold predictions for the future of warfare. Plus, we hear frontline reaction from soldiers to the so-called pauses in the fighting. Were they real?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 29th of April, 3 years and 65 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by Ukrainian journalist and staff writer at The Spectator, Svitlana Morenets, and former tank commander and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. But first, a summary from me of the most significant military and political developments of the past 24 hours. Today's military updates will be a little less granular because I want to give proper attention to a fascinating intervention by Valerii Zaluzhnyi, former Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, of course, and now Ukraine's ambassador to Britain. He's offered his strategic outlook of the conflict and its ramifications for warfare itself. But for now, suffice to say, there was the usual bombardment of Ukrainian cities and towns overnight, with 3 people in Kyiv needing treatment, but none seriously hurt, according to authorities. Though in Dnipropetrovsk, in the southeast of the country, a 12-year-old girl died, and her young sibling was seriously injured after both became trapped under rubble when a drone hit their house in Samar, just northeast of Dnipro. The Russian Defense Ministry has said its troops have captured the village of Doroshivka in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region, the second village to be captured by Moscow's troops there in as many days. Again, however, it bears repeating there's no sign of any breakthrough. Most experts believe the Russians are simply not capable of anything more than this slow, grinding manoeuvre, which comes at an extraordinarily high cost in manpower and material. Perhaps the most significant development in military terms of the past 24 hours, though, is that both Russia and North Korea have now officially confirmed what we've been reporting for months, that thousands of Pyongyang's troops were fighting against Ukraine's forces in Kursk. Yesterday, the Russian MOD shared a video showing the training of the North Koreans, with Putin expressing gratitude to Kim Jong-un for the entire people of North Korea's heroism, excellent training and dedication displayed while fighting, shoulder to shoulder with Russian soldiers, defending our motherland as their own. Note, no reference to the slaughter that many of the North Koreans apparently were sent into, being utilised as cannon fodder to reduce Russian losses on their own territory, nor any remarks about the quality of the training they received, which was apparently woefully inadequate for the task and might explain some of the wave attacks that we saw and reported several weeks ago. China has refused to comment on the deployment of North Korean troops in Ukraine. A spokesman said that any interaction between Pyongyang and Moscow, including military cooperation, is their own business. But bear in mind that the only reason North Korea, a totalitarian nightmare too often dismissed as a joke without a thought for the poor people who have to endure it day in, day out, has been able to survive its communist deep freeze for so many decades is due to Chinese financial support and political cover. If they'd wanted to stop this intervention, they could have. And the fact that they haven't is, I would argue, extremely revealing. But before we turn to the major political updates, I want us to reflect on the remarks of Zaluzhnyi at the UK-Ukraine Defence Tech Forum on Friday. For those of you who've been with us for a long time, he's expanded upon his analysis from when he was still Commander-in-Chief, but this time with practical lessons on what it means for all Western countries and the future of warfare. Now, I'm going to quote him quite extensively here. This is a short abridgment that I've done, but I think it is worth reading in this way for flow. Gradually, as in World War I, this war entered a stupor. In 2024, technological progress led to a situation where drones were no longer the only means of striking targets, not only in front of the front line, but also in operational depth behind the lines. This made it impossible to find any equipment, firepower or reserves beyond even the front line. Precision strikes on logistics routes have become commonplace. Moreover, such strikes are already part of tactics of forcing out positions. Thus, a 10 to 15 kilometre zone of continuous death was formed in front of the front line. It is no longer surprising when a drone hunts not for a group target or an armoured object, but even for an individual soldier. By the way, this zone is constantly expanding, as is the probability of being destroyed. Why has it become possible? Firstly, the rapid deployment and development of electronic warfare. It was thanks to that development that it was possible to neutralise the ability of satellite technologies, radio and GPS-guided munitions to deliver high-precision strikes at the operational level. The effectiveness of expensive missiles and precision-guided munitions has dropped to zero. Second, a large number of visual reconnaissance and strike drones of tactical and operational levels have appeared on the battlefield. Thus, we can say with confidence that, thanks to unmanned systems and digital technologies, the traditional and familiar types of weapons that defined the nature of war for decades have become history. They are gone. Armoured vehicles, which have been the basis of offensive operations since 1915, have become defenceless against cheap drones, and therefore their use in other types of combat is impossible today. High-precision weapons that use GPS positioning have lost their effectiveness due to the development of electronic warfare. Air defence is undergoing perhaps the biggest transformation. The emergence of a large number of small and cheap drones has made the use of extremely expensive missiles for air defence systems economically impractical. The airspace above the battlefield became inaccessible to manned aircraft and turned it into an auxiliary means of air defence. Aviation needs modernisation and the ability to conduct reconnaissance and strike from completely different distances. The sea space has gradually been occupied by naval drones. Now powerful ships hide in protected ports. All of this requires a complete rethinking of the forms and means of application. As a result, the military doctrine must be revised. This will lead to a revision of the principles of organising armed forces and ultimately to defence planning. I think that for our enemies this process will take no more than 3 years, and taking into account the scaling, 5. It is obvious, therefore, that victory on the battlefield now depends entirely on the ability to outpace the enemy in technological development. Manufacturers must be flexible and adaptable, ready to make changes to their hardware solutions at any time. If your hardware solutions are regulated by state bureaucracy or corrupt interests, the chain will break and the enemy will be ahead. The speed of innovation implementation directly increases a state's ability to achieve victory in war. Quite a statement, that. Zaluzhnyi concludes by saying, "The Ukrainian experience has become unique. We were the first to be forced to restructure our army, industry and strategy in response to challenges that others are only beginning to realise. These challenges are not just for Ukraine. They are challenges for everyone." Now, that analysis tallies with much of what we've seen in the past year or more of war. Here in Britain, we await the Strategic Defence Review, and it will be interesting to see how much technological innovation is at the forefront of that. Not everyone will agree with the ambassador's analysis, but I think it's fair to say that it cannot be ignored. But turning to the political realm, the Ukrainians have doubled down on their reaction to Putin's 3-day truce proposal yesterday, with the head of Zelensky's presidential office, Andrei Yermak, saying the ceasefire is needed not for a parade, but for real and sustainable peace. Interestingly, Donald Trump's spokeswoman also indicated that the president finds Putin's 3-day pause unsatisfactory, calling for a permanent peace. And there are some who are optimistic that the tone is changing out of this administration with regards to Ukraine, although I'm not entirely convinced, I should say myself, but others are thinking something is shifting. But the Russians seem to be doubling down. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has given an interview where he has rejected the current proposed peace plans with the following. And just listen to some of this language here. He describes one of the pillars of peace consisting of overcoming the legacy of the neo-Nazi regime which took power in Kiev after the February 2014 putsch, including the initiative by its perpetrators to eradicate and cancel in both physical and legislative terms everything Russian, be it the Russian language, media, culture, traditions, or Orthodox faith. The international recognition of Crimea, Sevastopol, the DPR, the LPR, the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions as part of Russia is also imperative. Demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine is also on the agenda, along with lifting sanctions, withdrawing lawsuits and cancelling arrest warrants, as well as returning Russian assets subjected to the so-called freeze in the West. We will also insist on obtaining solid security guarantees for Russia in order to shield it from any threats emanating from hostile activities by Nato, the EU, and some of their member states along our western border. So again, not a whiff of any shift away from Moscow's maximalist objectives. Although, it has to be said, Lavrov is sometimes contradicted by the Kremlin, and it could just be them reinstating a hardline stance so that then, if they're forced to backpedal, Russia can say, we made concessions. One of the key problems for Kyiv in all of this is that the Americans still remain convinced, it seems, that Ukraine is on the back foot and set to collapse. In an interview with The Atlantic to mark 100 days in office, although it was given before his meeting with Zelensky in Rome, which some argue has shifted the tone quite considerably, he said, "I think I'm saving Ukraine. I think that nation will be crushed very shortly. It's a big war machine. I think I'm doing a great service to Ukraine. I believe that." He then refused to commit to sending additional aid to the country, saying support didn't have to come in terms of weapons. There are many forms of weapons. Doesn't have to be weapons with bullets. It could be weapons with sanctions. It could be weapons with banking. It can be many other weapons. Now, that stance isn't just hypothetical. It's having real-world impacts today. A fleet of retired tanks remains stuck in Australia, with defence figures there in part blaming resistance from the US for their delayed transfer. But, and it's a big one, Trump's leverage, as I've talked about before, may be on the wane over the Ukrainian theatre and beyond. The victory of Mark Carney in Canada, thanks to Trump's bellicose rhetoric about turning the country into the 51st American state, might be indicative of the direction of travel. The political tectonic plates in the US are also shifting, with more and more conservative voices breaking ranks, as it were, to criticise Trump's policies, whether on economics or foreign policy. Perhaps the most noteworthy this week was the high-profile commentator Ben Shapiro's interview with President Zelensky, where he attacked the White House's approach to Ukraine, arguing that whilst the country, i.e. Ukraine, may not be perfect, it is an ally, whereas Russia is clearly an enemy. He also said that he'd come away from his meeting with Zelensky believing the Ukrainians were sincere in their desire for peace, but that the Russian position was still unclear and deliberately vague. Now, I think we can expect more of that kind of shift in the rhetoric over the coming weeks and certainly months. But let's look at the frontline reaction to some of the ceasefire proposals and indeed the Easter truce that we saw before. Svitlana, welcome back to the podcast. The last time we spoke to you was before you were about to go back to the front to see how soldiers celebrated Easter. Then, of course, the truce happened, or did it happen? What impact did that actually realistically have? What did the soldiers say to you?
Well, the only impact the truce had is that Ukrainian soldiers don't believe anymore for a single moment that Putin is serious about any ceasefire in Ukraine. The Easter truce, so-called truce, I was in the Kramatorsk at the time, The truce partially worked because there were no air raid alerts all over the country, and for the first time in many, many months, the city was calm. There were no explosions. The people, many of them are still living there. The front line is just 20 kilometers away, but there are lots of kids and families staying there, and they had the opportunity to have some Easter celebrations and go to churches. I went to a church, a wooden old church where all of the soldiers arrived. The day before, all the police in Kramatorsk, they checked all the churches for explosives or, I don't know, anything that could be dangerous on the Easter day. But they told me that everything went well, they didn't find anything. I met during the day in that church the soldiers from different brigades, the commanders, and all of them told me that at their parts of the front line there were less shellings, and for example it was calm for 1 hour, for 3 hours somewhere, but eventually Russians started attacking or using the artillery or drones or just assault troops. Everybody was very disappointed but not surprised because many Ukrainian soldiers have been fighting since 2014 or just 2018, and they know what ceasefires with Russia mean. They are always broken. When I asked them how do they think this war should end, how it will likely end, and there were very different opinions depending whom I talked to. You could actually see how different is the mood in the Ukrainian army. Some soldiers said that Ukraine should agree to the ceasefire, even Trump's deal that he is trying to impose, because Ukraine needs that pause more than Russia needs. We need to mobilize more troops, to train the soldiers better, to gather more arms, to build better fortifications. They are very tired. They want to go home to their families, and the ceasefire is urgently needed. But at the same time, other soldiers told me that no, we should keep fighting as long as it takes, because Russia will never stop until it conquers all of Ukraine, and they prefer to fight the Russian army now rather than let it for their children to fight Russia in a couple of years. And it's what most of the Ukrainians and soldiers especially are afraid of, that whatever deal is reached right now, that it will be just broken as a Minsk agreement, and they will have to return. Even worse, their children will have to go to the front line in a couple of years. I came here to Ukraine a month ago, and I was quite naively hoping that there will be some kind of truce. I actually came here to write about the truce on Ukraine's front line. Week passed, another week passed. Now Putin announced the temporary ceasefire on the Victory Day. And I just can see that there is no peace going to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. Putin is not interested in stopping his war at all. And I saw some reports today that he has ordered Russian troops to break into the Dnipropetrovsk region. They are just like about 5 kilometers from the borderline between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. And today, Ukrainian government announced evacuation from the villages on that borderline.
I think that speaks to what we've been sensing on the podcast as well for some time, but fascinating to hear that confirmed not only from your experience but also the experiences of soldiers themselves. Were there any other experiences from your time or after the front line that stick out to you?
Where to start, Francis? I was trying to get into Pokrovsk again for the second time. The last time I couldn't. This time, I will spoiler, I couldn't either because it's impossible. The city is so heavily shelled by drones. But when I was trying to get there to the 25th Brigade, I was picked up in Kramatorsk first by one soldier who was going to bring me to Dobropilya. It's a little town next to Pokrovsk, which is a bit safer. But he told me that he had to leave me in one junction and another soldier will pick me up because Russian drone hit the Ukrainian base where was the shells and the weapons. He was very distressed and almost crying because he feared that some of his friends died. And we could see actually the fire and the shells were kept exploding. It was a horrible picture. But thankfully, nobody died. They were not at the base when Russian drone struck it, but they lost all of the weapons they had and the cars. The military cars that the Ukrainian soldiers have, most of them have been gathered from donations from Ukrainians or foreigners. And he said that he bought a car, he took a credit for that car, and he has still been saving up money and asking for donations, and it was burned in that fire. So, of course, he was very sad because of that. When he left me and another soldier came to pick me up, his name is Pavlo, and he brought me to the location of the brigade. We had to drive very, very fast and at night, once again, because of the Russian drone that could strike us at any moment. And we got lucky, but unfortunately, the next day I found out that when Pavlo was coming back, the Russian drone hit his car. And he is very heavily injured. Unfortunately, I don't know what is his state now, but he was at the hospital a couple of days ago. And I will let you know how it goes, and I just hope he recovers fast. But it's just to show you how vulnerable life is there next to the front line, even not on the ground zero where you are in the trenches, but just trying to get there when soldiers bring the weapons or food to the soldier stations in the trenches. It is, they say, to be a driver right now is the most dangerous job in Ukraine's front line because you're just being hunted by Russian drones constantly.
And that speaks to the remarks I was just quoting by Zaluzhnyi on the transformations in warfare as a result of drone technology. And it's just horrific to hear.
I want to add about that, about the drones, about the fiber optic drones. It is such a huge problem right now. And the soldiers told me that Avdiivka actually was lost because of the fiber optic drones. Because Russians started using them first and they produced them on the mass scale and then just attacked Ukrainian soldiers there, and they didn't have anything how to shoot them down because the jamming systems don't work against these drones, and the only option that they had is to take the guns and trying to shoot them down, but you expose yourself and you try to do it because you have to go out in the open and try to shoot a drone that is flying towards you, and there is a very high chance that they will hit you. A drone unit that I was with, they told me that actually they were first to offer these fiber optic technologies like over a year ago to the Ukrainian command, but they were not listened to, and then the Russians did it first. And only now Ukraine has started producing them, and in the unit that I was, they took 12 drones to test. They received them from the state. But this number is nothing compared to what the Russians have. And they say Ukraine is producing right now these drones, and one costs about £1,500. But you can use this drone only once. It just flies in one direction. It doesn't come back. Give them to all of the brigades. It's a lot of money. Hopefully, there will be more soon on Ukraine's front line. But they still haven't found a way how to shoot the Russian drones down, except for the guns. There is also the laser technology, but again, not every brigade possesses it on Ukraine's front line. I would say like little to no one has it. It's a real problem, and it could impact significantly the defense of Pokrovsk.
That's very interesting. Now, you were on the front line when there was that terrible attack on Kyiv, and I think I'm right in saying, because you and I were messaging, that you arrived back in Kyiv the following day after that bombardment. What was the mood like there when you arrived compared to how it had been when you left it?
It was terrible. You know that Easter truce, even it was short and it was just not on the front line, but the rest of Ukraine, there was hope that maybe these kind of attacks will stop. There will be no missile and drones attacks on the Ukrainian civilians after the Kryvyi Rih and Sumy horrific incidents before that. I didn't go to the bombing site because I just arrived in Kyiv a bit late and I had to work. But I saw and the messages from my friends and the photos from the site where the classmates of one of the killed. There was a boy called Danilo who was 17, and he and his parents died because of that bombing. There were like a dozen of classmates waiting for 12 hours outside of that apartment block, hoping that he will be rescued, that he will be alive, but unfortunately he was killed. And the funeral was just yesterday. It is a horrific scene to see, and what Ukrainian children have to go through because of this war. There is a song that was written last year in Ukraine, and there is a sentence that says that all of us who are under 18, but we are already veterans here. And it describes the situation in Ukraine so well, because children here can differentiate the sounds of missiles, drones, Ukrainian air defenses, even artillery, those living close to the front line. It's horrible. It's horrible. I wish it never happened with Ukrainian children and any children at all in the world.
It reminds me of when I was in Kharkiv at the underground school and was sitting in on a lesson that was teaching children not to touch strange teddy bears because of the chance of them being booby-trapped by Russian soldiers. And that just one example says so much, and I'll never, ever forget that. Svitlana, thank you very much for your time. I know you've got so much going on because of your reporting in Ukraine. Is there anything that we've not talked about, whether it be on the front line, whether it be the mood in Kyiv now, that you'd like to reference before we go?
Yes, I would like to say a couple of words about Viktoria Roshchina, the Ukrainian journalist who was killed in Russian captivity. Today, 46 journalists from Ukraine and also foreign media, they released an investigation about her death. A little backstory about Victoria. 2 years ago, she tried to go to Russian-occupied lands in Ukraine to investigate about how Russia detains and tortures Ukrainians living under occupation. And she went through Russia there, and she was detained there, and she was moved from one Russian colony to another one, and eventually she died there. And her body was returned to Ukraine 2 years later, just recently, and there was an investigation. It was found that she was tortured while she was held captive, and she died because she was strangled. And Russians tried to hide this evidence, and they removed some of her organs, because when they investigated her body, it was missing some organs. Her rib was broken. It's horrific. She was just 27. So the journalists, they released the investigation about her detention and her death, and also trying to continue her work to show what is really happening to Ukrainians living under Russian occupation. And I really, really recommend everyone to watch it and to read about it. It is called Victoria Project by Forbidden Stories, just to see why Ukrainians are so against giving up Ukrainian lands to Russia, because they know what is happening to anyone who has a Ukrainian passport in those territories.
Well, thank you very much, Svitlana, for your reflections. Let's bring in Hamish to Bretton-Gordon now. Hamish, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you on the airwaves. What was your reaction, first of all, to the proposal by Putin that now was the time for a 3-day ceasefire?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for having me back on. And I think we need to be pretty circumspect about this. One factor, it's likely that the Russians, as they say, have retaken Kursk Oblast, which was potentially one of Zelensky's key bargaining chips. And that might increase Putin's willingness to bargain. However, the Russians have just had yet another top general assassinated virtually on the steps of the Kremlin. And one can see why Putin and his close circle may be somewhat spooked by the ease with which the Ukrainian Secret Service or their proxies are now operating in the Russian capital. And that really sings to Putin not wanting any disruption to the Victory in Europe anniversary events that are happening across Russia. It could also be that now the mothers of Russia are starting to be heard, and we've talked about them before. After 17,000 dead in Afghanistan, they forced the Kremlin to withdraw in ignominy from there. Now, a lot of people view that Putin is responsible for the million casualties that have been suffered thus far, and maybe the state media can no longer suppress these horrendous rates. I personally believe that the Russian army is pretty close to its culminating point. In other words, it's running out of steam. With Trump possibly now siding more with Zelensky, Putin is canny enough to realize that if he can freeze the war today or in the next couple of days, then that will allow him to potentially either show it as a great victory or regroup. And I think a lot of people are concerned about that. What I'd just like to go through on this is what a real expert who knows about these things and his sort of interpretation, particularly what I wrote as far as the ceasefire. He goes on, I think your skeptical assessment is correct. Distract, deflect, deceive, and to add a couple more verbs beginning with the letter D, disconcert and discombobulate. That is the standard Kremlin playbook. A 72-hour ceasefire proposal is total humbug, given that he's ignored or reformulated several other proposals from other parties. I suspect you're right about him being desperate for a breather. He's running out of time, people, money and resources, but still confident that we'll buckle first. The trouble is, Zelensky's playing against two opponents, Putin and Trump. The latter may be more susceptible to blandishments, but no less tricky to deal with. So I think generally from that, the jury is out. We're all pretty sceptical, and I'll be very interested, Francis, to hear what the view is on the front line.
Well, thanks very much for that, Hamish. And I wonder as well, something I didn't cover in my summary of the news earlier on was the remarks of Dmitry Medvedev. Of course, Putin's lapdog, as he's sometimes described as. I mean, we usually call him occasionally sober Dmitry Medvedev, given the insanity of some of the things. And he's at it again, Hamish. And I wonder if you could just give your assessment of what he said and how we should perhaps be thinking about this.
Exactly what you're talking about. Another outburst from Medvedev. As you say, he's not really, depends what time of the day that he's talking is quite how much sense that comes out of him. But again, brandishing the nuclear piece here, which, as we've discussed many times, virtually since the get-go, the Russians have thrown in the nuclear conundrum because they know that, absolutely petrifies everybody and particularly leaders in Europe. And what he's talking about here is the previous non-aligned states of Sweden and Finland, which are, of course, now in NATO, and I think really tip the balance very firmly in NATO's favour from a military perspective. But I think Medvedev is trying to counter that by saying, right, well, you are now susceptible to nuclear strikes from Russia, which I'm sure they probably were in practice rather than theory beforehand. But I think what is important here for people to consider, and I wrote about this 2 weeks ago in the paper about the nuclear equilibrium, if you like, or the imbalance. Now, without sort of talking about nuclear capabilities of various opposing sides, which could go on for ages, I think most people are aware that mutually assured destruction is about the balance between strategic nuclear weapons, ostensibly between the Americans and the Russians. However, ourselves, the Brits and the French have a key part to play in it. And actually even a more key part now. If the US is stepping back, as President Trump is telling us, and if that backstop of the the American nuclear capability isn't there, it sort of creates an imbalance. And we have these are intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles, multiple warheads, 100 kilotons of explosion at the other end as well. Absolutely mega. But also, really since the birth of nuclear weapons after the Second World War, we had what we call tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons. These, they're still absolutely massive, but they're in the sort of sub 10 kilotons. That's 10,000 tons of basic explosive, as it were. The UK gave up its tactical nuclear weapons I think the last one went in 1998. So we don't have that ability to respond. And the exam question I sort of set the other day is, what would happen if, say, the Russians fired a tactical nuclear weapon into Finland or Sweden or one of those states that they possess a nuclear deterrence? What would we in Britain do? We were highly unlikely to fire a 10 kiloton device at the Kremlin. So my view was the assumption was that is what the Russians were working on, which is why things could be so effective. So I don't think we should take anything too seriously that comes out of Medyev's mouth at the moment. But I think it's all part of the wider piece that we have got this challenge with what Trump has been saying. Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been left out to a large part of it. We've got the Russians who are now perhaps realizing that Trump and his crew are not on their side. So is looking for a way out. Ceasefire, as we've discussed. Do they need to flex their muscles to try and hold everybody back? We shall see. But I think whenever you mention, that the nuclear thing is such a critical issue that might be in balance at the moment, it's something that, I think that the European NATO countries, those who are still, the coalition of the willing who are prepared to put troops into Ukraine to monitor it and support a ceasefire, I think particularly ourselves and the French need to make a statement about the nuclear piece, saying that actually, if Russia did try and use a nuclear weapon of any type against the Swedes and the Finns, as they said, then we would react in kind or certainly with a similar powerful type of capability. Over.
Well, thanks, Hamish. Just one final question. I was obviously speaking earlier on about those remarks by Zaluzhnyi on the future of warfare, and he's pretty dismissive in his speech about tanks and ships, and because basically of their vulnerability to drones. You're a former tankie. I wonder what your reaction was to that. Do you agree that perhaps not in the short term, but in the long term, because of the scaling up of the numbers of drones and how cheap they are to manufacture, that heavy weapons are done for?
That is a great question. And, somebody who's writing a book about tanks to be published on Father's Day in 2026, I might have a slightly different view from the great man. I think his key point, you need to be able to react more quickly to what your enemy's doing, particularly when it comes to capability, in order to overcome it. I think you just have to look at history. Virtually since the end of the First World War, people have said the tanks are over because something came up that overwhelmed them. And you could come to that conclusion as General Zaluzhnyi has, that maybe tanks and ships sort of had their day. But until Ukraine, the drone threat has not been an issue. It is now, but if you can nullify that drone threat, you still have a highly protected mobile vehicle that can pack a heck of a punch. Now, it's no secret that the Defence Science Technology Lab at Porton-Down are developing a laser system where each tank would be fitted with a laser or a bunch of lasers that are capable of knocking down hundreds of drones with £1 or $1 a fire of the laser. Now, if that works, as they say it would, you very quickly have these drones sort of being ineffective. So at the moment, I would say that the drone has the upper hand over the tank, and drones against capital ships probably have the upper hand. But the countermeasures that have been worked on will bring them back into prominence. Now, of course, it'll be, the countermeasure to the countermeasure. But I think historically, the fact that the tank hasn't really changed much, in the last 110 years since the Battle of Cambrai. It's still a protected vehicle that can pack a direct fire punch and still has utility. I mean, the Ukrainians are mainly using them for sort of as long range snipers, which, it is an effective way of doing it. So a very long answer to your question, Francis. Maybe at the moment they're having less utility, but I think when something like the Dragonfire laser capability or a similar one that's looked to put onto tanks, then they will be back with prominence, and I think the Dragonfire device is the one for capital ships. So if you can nullify that threat, then you can crack on.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish. One of the virtues of doing a daily podcast is that we can have long answers, so we very much welcome that. We've just got time for final thoughts. Hamish, where do you want to leave our listeners?
Yeah, thanks very much. And as you introduced me as a tank commander and chemical weapons specialist, I'm regularly in touch with frontline brigades, trying to help them out. And again, last weekend, multiple uses of ostensibly chloropicrin. There have been some muses that something else might be used, but yeah, I obviously don't want to set any hairs running. It is the 28th anniversary today of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the OPCW meeting. I believe the Ukrainian government have produced a report detailing 7,000 uses of chemical weapons on the front line in the last 18 months, which is quite unbelievable. And stand fast the drones, which are obviously having a huge impact. Actually, the First World War tactic of using basic chemical weapons to clear trenches is having a huge impact. Hopefully, I'll be able to do in a few months' time, with people who've been at the front end, do a real sort of deep dive so people can understand it. So, my final thought is on, all these other horrendous weapons have been used. And as we covered a few weeks ago, thank God, the British government are now sending out 65,000 British gas masks, respirators to the front line. The countermeasure of a decent gas mask should nullify the effect of these chemical weapons being used. So hopefully when we talk about this in a few months' time, it won't be an issue because everybody in the front line will have a decent gas mask and the Russian chloropicrin will have no impact. But it is another morbid anniversary today. Over.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.